I was watching cliff diving the other day, bear with me. And a part of the judging criteria has less to do with the complexity of the dive, but it has to do with the diver entering the water. The splash you make, the smaller the splash, the better for your score. Now with watches there is a similar principle, and with this Speedmaster, as ambitious as it was, with a design that was interesting, that was looking back in time, with tons of potential, which I hope to explore. Well, as we know, it did not make a splash, and that's a bad thing. A name that we so greatly appreciate and enjoy is Omega, and it's a name that produces some of the most aesthetically pleasing watches out there. And I would be one of the first people to highlight the many great pieces they make. It's almost impossible to list them. I mean, from the Aquaterras, Railmasters, Seamasters, 300s professionals, the Speedmaster line, the myriad of watches that would take you months to just categorize, let alone discuss individually. But let's also not make the mistake in saying that Omega only produces great-looking watches. They have had quite a few flops in their time too. Some of which look downright awful, others which have a cult following at this point. And one collection of pieces that springs to mind that's actually quite linked to the ones we're talking about today, the dynamic range. From that simple time only to the chronograph. These watches are 90s, early 2000s, all the way. And they've always had a level of enthusiasm around them because of where they found their inspiration, the time that they were made, and the value for money that they offer. But it's fair to say that a watch like the Dynamic is not on that prescribed list of watches to pursue. And in fact, what makes them so good and appealing to a lot of us is because they have this underground feel, that even decades later they haven't been truly discovered or appreciated for what they offer. So anyway, a few years back, the Chronoscope name returned under the Speedmaster line, which was questionable, as it is. Obviously did that because the Speedmaster name is world-renowned and everyone would recognize it. And when I hear the name Chronoscope, I'm immediately transported into a doctor's surgery. It's like, are you ready? I'm about to insert the chronoscope. Take a deep breath. It doesn't really roll off the tongue very well, does it? But in actual fact, the origins of this watch never was affiliated with the Speedmaster. It was a part of the DeVille line, if I'm not mistaken. And back then, well, it definitely had that 2000s feel to its design. And I think about leaving the 90s and into the 2000s, it was a really odd time, and the designs, they were all over the place. I think there's something very novel about these pieces, but at the same time, I believe these to be some of the worst received Speedmasters in recent memory. And in this chronoscopy, I'm going to explore why. To understand this oddity, we have to transport ourselves back to the 1930s and the 1940s, where brands like Longines and Omega were creating some of the most beautiful watches of their time. It truly was the golden age for chronograph design. When you look to Longines, you think of the caliber 13ZN, and when you look to Omega, you look at the caliber 33.3. Just absolutely beautiful. Now, of course, these were watches of the time, and you can definitely see that by the choice of colors, by the choice of scales around the dial, how the cases were designed, how they were sized, and the types of people that they were aimed towards. We've got to bear in mind that the 1930s and 40s, it wasn't exactly a great time in human history. And a lot of these watches, the chronographs in particular, with telemeter scales and all the rest on their dials, they were aimed at military personnel, officers in particular. The criteria and instructions set for these sorts of watches, they weren't only made to be beautiful and functional pieces of design, but they were also made to be tools for Navy personnel, timing the shot, for people on the battlefields, timing the trajectories. This was such a distinct period of history in watch design, especially when we transitioned into the 1940s. And beyond that, once we started moving into the 50s and onwards, a lot of these scales and details disappeared in favor of legibility, in favor of simpler things like GMT or timing your speed, or stints in between intervals. I guess what I'm trying to say is, as we transitioned out of the 30s and 40s and moved into the jet-powered nuclear age, we lost a lot of these very accurate measuring features on watches in favor of simplicity. And I think the long and short of it is that this Speedmaster Chronoscope wants to try and reignite that flame with its release. What made it such a strange piece too is it debuted a few new features, like the micro-adjusting clasp, the easy adjust. So you don't need to be a professional or a design guru to see this watch and notice that it's almost riddled with juxtapositions. Like from its dial being inspired from the 1930s and 40s with all these many different scales and different color accents, we then look around the watch and we move to its quite modern looking tachymeter bezel scale, a case that's inspired from mid to late 1960s designs, and a bracelet that's more transitional into the 70s and the 80s. When you break up this watch, look at it separately, it's fine, but together it is quite literally a Frankenstein's monster of parts. And that, I think, in many ways is the reason why it's turned so many people off from even looking at it, let alone questioning its existence, which, I mean, I think that's what we're all wondering. When you look at the dial and the level of detail inside it, the many concentric circles, the snail shell scales as they were known, you can see just how much thought and care went into this, even with the choice of handset and that leaf styling. The moment you leave the dial and you look to the rest of the case and the bracelet, it just doesn't seem like it fits. And I think when this watch debuted years ago, I made a video talking about how if they put this in a CK case, a CK2998 case, it would have made a world of difference. I still stand by that, and in fact I would even go further by saying they should have given this a true-to-form 1930s case instead. It could have still had that Speedmaster affiliation, but with a case that actually complements the dial. And I guess a lot of us are asking that question subconsciously of why was it so poorly received? Why was it not spoken about or covered in more detail? I think it has to do with the many roadblocks that a piece like this established. From its larger 43mm diameter. At this time, the prices of Omega watches were continually climbing. And then when you turn the watch around and you see that you don't have a 3861 caliber, you have a twin barrel 9908 caliber with nothing to really look at. All the major components of the watch are hidden by a massive plate, save for the column wheel and the balance wheel. You migrate over to a dial that is very time specific, it's very particular to the 1930s and 40s, which unfortunately is polarizing, and it's not exactly one that can suit every strap, that can suit every occasion. As most of us know, versatility today is the name of the game, and the standard Speedmaster knows this better than most. I've always seen the Speedmaster Chronoscope as a textbook example of a failure to communicate. The brand gave it an incredible, historic, inspired dial, but they fitted it into a case with a bracelet and added all of these parts that does not communicate what this watch is, what it does, and the history that inspired it. Now yes, there are those oddballs out there, people like me, who do appreciate watches even though they don't necessarily get everything right. But even to us, it's a piece that raises eyebrows. Now yes, affiliation says you can see it as a Speedmaster from the distance. The design of the case and bracelet, they're so iconic, they're easy to recognize. But in this one instance, maybe that name, it didn't need to be there. Maybe the Chronoscope name would have been better set by itself. The one huge bonus to come out of this is that these watches are quite attainable today. They've definitely been given quite the big price gouge over the last few years, and second-hand you can pick them up for a great price. So the sad reality is that this is a Speedmaster that arrived, that disappeared, that a lot of us forgot. And I cannot believe at the time of this recording this watch is almost 3 years old. And the brand has tried to reignite interest with this piece, with the Paris Olympics around the corner, but just as when it was new, it's still a piece that leaves us scratching our heads and wondering, what were they doing? So as much as I can appreciate this watch's dial design especially, and the history that it's paying tribute towards, it's just a shame that it was let down by conformity and bad communication. So what are your thoughts on this oddity? Is the Chronoscope a watch that would ever appeal to you? Is it a name that you've ever looked at? Have you even heard or taken notice of the Speedmaster before? Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. See you in the next one.